Session is going to be live streamed throughout the community and also is being recorded. And so any individual that wants to replay the information would be able to do so. After this session, the regular board meeting is scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. and we'll begin that on time. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Sue Gertis, who is the finance coordinator for the Prescott Public Schools. And Sue.
Now we can put my slide. Okay. All right, so some of you have seen this slide before. I think it does a really nice job of pictorially saying where we're at with our cash fund balance. The line that drops off dramatically is what will happen if we don't do anything. The dotted line is where our fund balance should be per our safe harbor calculation to help with the ebbs and flows of the payments going out and the cash receipts coming in. The green line and the blue line are what will change with the referendum. So we really ideally want to be where the blue line is because we won't cross below the red dotted line until after the next 2 bienniums from now. We will be safe until then. So that catches you all up with, that is why we're here, to fix this. And so now we have a solution to this problem, and the solution is being brought to us by R.W. BAIRD. This is Elise Mern, and she works with their forecasting and school business. She's a school business specialist. So she is going to take us through a lot of the ins and outs of referendums. She has a lot of expertise. She's been with them for 8 years. So take it away.
Thank you. Hello everybody, my name's Elise Mern. Thanks Sue for the intro. So I work on the BAIRD Public Finance team. We work with school districts all across the state. All the way to tiny Washington Island that has 31 students in the entire school district, to Milwaukee Public Schools, who just approved, they're going to vote on operating referendum this April for almost $250 million. So all that to say that our team, we see a lot of school finance topics. We work with districts all across the state, and Prescott is certainly not unique in their need to go to referendum this time around, but we also try to kind of obviously explain the exciting topic of school finance as well. The way that schools are funded is different than how our homes or other areas of our lives are funded, and so our goal tonight is to really make school finance as digestible as possible and help to explain how Prescott found itself in this position and kind of the plan moving forward. So the individuals that you see on the screen are myself and my teammates. The SBS team on the bottom represents over 50 years of experience in school business offices. So we work with school business managers in their roles to kind of help communicate some of these more complex school finance topics. The team above is the school banking team. They typically deal in the world of debt referenda or capital, long-term capital planning. So I believe this new building is as a result of a capital referendum, and that is the banking team. So those are different. We're going to dive into that a little bit later, but that's the BAIRD team that helps serve school districts all across the state. Tonight you'll be seeing visuals from our BAIRD budget forecast model. It is a tool that over 60% of school districts in the state use. And it is similar to a weather forecast that we try to look ahead with the best variables that we know at the time, right? So at this point in time, we have access to established certain information, and we try to make a plan for the future with the information that we have at hand. So 60% of school districts use that tool in order to help plan for the what-ifs and unknowns. So tonight our goal will be to talk, 10,000-foot view about how schools are funded, go a little bit into some referendum trends, what we're seeing across the state, and then speak specifically to what's happening in Prescott. So when we think about referendum, we think primarily of the two different types. We have our capital referendum, which are used to issue debt, and usually are for large-scale projects, renovations, new buildings, usually have a higher sticker amount. And the other type of referendum is an operating referendum, and those go strictly towards the operations of the day-to-day life in a school, right? So we're thinking staff, which makes up the majority of a district's operating costs, maintenance, busing, food service, etc. So in 2022, the district passed a capital referendum. This is different. Tonight we're talking about an operating referendum, totally separate, funds completely different things. And they're actually segregated into separate funds. There's no commingling whatsoever. So these dollars will go strictly towards operating the day-to-day of the school district. So within the operating referendum world, there's two types. So there's recurring, which is ongoing, and then non-recurring, which is approved only for a certain period of time that the board authorizes. I believe Neighbors in River Falls just recently approved a recurring question. And so the type of referendum in Prescott is similar, right? So it will be a recurring, it will be an ongoing referendum. So as I mentioned before, an operating referendum will increase the dollar amount that goes to that pink box on the screen. There are other funds that make up the district's total school-based tax levy, and that is what gets distributed to the local taxpayer. So we'll be talking a little bit later about mill rate and tax impacts, but know that this operational referendum goes towards that pink and purple box, and it is called the revenue limit tax levy. It is a formula that we're about to dive into that limits the amount of revenue that a school can use. So that revenue limit tax levy is driven by this formula on the screen here. Okay, so that is a cap. It is the maximum amount that a school district is able to raise through property taxes and state equalization aid. Okay, so districts, what portion comes from the taxpayer and what portion comes from the state looks different in every school district. So in a school district like Gibraltar, for example, which is way up in Door County, where they have a high amount of property wealth per student, the majority of that revenue limit authority goes to the taxpayer. Very little comes from the state because they're viewed as property wealthy. Versus in Beloit, it's the exact opposite. Down south, they have, it's almost the entirety of their formula is funded from the state, and then the balance goes to the taxpayer, which is something for them like 1%. So it looks different everywhere, that division of what comes from the state and what comes via the local property tax levy. So when districts are looking to raise additional revenue, there are a couple of ways to do that. One is via the biennial budget, so state legislature, and the other is local authority, so seeking community support through a vote. Okay, so this formula was established in 1993, and at that time it capped districts at whatever levy they needed at that time. So 30 years ago, some districts were growing some districts were shrinking, some districts were cutting, some districts were under construction, and that formula, or where they were at that time, has not been revisited in the last 30 years. However, there are exemptions. So that's kind of the plus sign, that third part of this equation, where districts can seek additional authority in order to override that formula. Other ways, as I mentioned the biennial budget, but then a recurring referendum actually helps to grow the district's number, and it's ongoing. So that district membership, the first part of the equation is the district's 3-year rolling average, okay? The per pupil dollar amount is set by the state, right? So that's that revenue limit component. It can be increased via the biennial budget or via recurring referendum. And then those exemptions, recurring or non-recurring exemptions, get added on in order to equal our maximum revenue limit authority, which makes up the majority of a district's revenue. So sometimes when districts are in this position that they're going to referendum, they're seeing deficits in future years, they say, well, couldn't we increase fees? Couldn't we do some fundraisers? You know, I'd be willing to contribute, I'd be willing to donate. What can we do as a community other than raise our taxes? So the reason why we would love to do all those things, that would help, certainly. However, if the majority of a district's operating revenue comes from this formula, this is where the majority of the additional funding is going to come from. So kind of calling out a few trends in those pieces of the formula. The first one is that district membership, that 3-year rolling average. So in Prescott, for the last 5 years, the district has seen a loss of 62 FTE. So if that is the first bubble and that number is going down, it stands to reason then that the district's revenue would be going down over time as well. This graph is visually very overwhelming. However, the important points to call out, the numbers represented, the 11,074 represents the district's maximum revenue per member, which is that second bubble there. Okay, so the 11,074 is Prescott's maximum revenue per member, and that is almost more than $500 below what the state is receiving on average. So on average, Prescott receives over $500 less than the rest of the state. Now I mentioned the other way that districts could see increases to that per pupil dollar amount via the biennial budget. So this graph here represents, and I believe this has been in some of the district's correspondence, this is on the district's website, the difference between my graph and the ones that the district has is that we have an extra year, okay, and the gap is growing, so it's in fact larger. And we also put a bar in order to kind of quantify, that black bar represents Act 10. So post Act 10, which is when districts saw a lot of actual, savings, there was still a gap between what was given as a result of inflation and what was given via the revenue limit. However, the disparity has been $33.80 per pupil over this period of time. So the biennial budget is a way that the legislature gives additional funding to schools. And prior to 1993, before revenue limits, that was indexed against inflation. So there were inflationary increases given up until, I think I said revenue limits, but what I meant to say was Act 10. And since that time, the disparity between what's been given and what's been happening with inflation has grown. So if you were to crunch those numbers, if districts had been given inflationary increases as they had been prior to Act 10, Prescott would have over $4 million. So my team helps to model scenarios around the biennial budget as well. And we had some districts in areas of the state plugging that number in to their budget model and saying, this would solve our need to go to referendum. We wouldn't have to go to referendum if this dollar amount was provided via the biennial budget. So this slide has similar information, but put slightly different. So this is the history of revenue limit increases through the eyes of a student who kind of lived through this era of time. So a student who was a kindergartner in 09-10, that was the first year that revenue limits were separated from inflation. And in that year, school districts were provided $200 per pupil. And in that year, that was $75 behind inflation. Okay, so the next year when there are 5Kers, that number has grown to $156 behind inflation. And so you can kind of see as the class of 2023 progresses and ultimately graduates, schools are 32-35 behind inflationary increases. So I'm actually going to pause for a moment. Does anyone have any questions on the formula? Oh, I'm seeing a lot of hands raising, so I'll start in the back, if that's okay.
What is the amount spent per pupil? You say a $2,000 difference. What are we spending right now? What's cutting out? What
is coming in per pupil? So this most recent biennial budget provided $325 per pupil. So those dollars, that per pupil dollar amount, what gets added to it this past year was $325. So when I'm talking about kind of that gap, it's what has been given to schools to add to that number in order to kind of try to keep up with inflationary costs.
What's the total amount we're spending per child?
It's on the next slide.
So this is the district's revenue per member.
It should be $14,000 if we had adjusted for inflation.
Would be higher, correct.
Mine's related to this slide.
Okay.
So can you explain why our district average per pupil is lower than the state average per pupil?
Yes. So as I mentioned, that per pupil dollar amount when revenue limits were established was different all across the state. And for a lot of districts, it was, in the $9,000 range. So the idea is that via the biennial budget, there would be increases given and that, districts would be able to continue to afford inflationary increases, right? So some districts early on realized that it wasn't going to be enough for them, and they went to referendum early on in the process, recurring referendum, that added to their base revenue limit authority and added to that per pupil dollar amount. So they naturally were, through the referendum process, had more money earlier on. They may have had to go back since that time, and that grows that number each time. Yes?
Are you saying then at that point at 10, our school district was so frugal, trying to do the best they can with the money, that we are continuing to pay the consequences of that? Where other districts may have been, like you said, more property,
Wealthy. Yes, so great question. It depends on the district. So each district saw a 5.5% reduction in their revenue per member. So if that number was already higher, if your revenue per member was already $14,000, that would take you down to a different point than somebody whose revenue per member was already at $10,000. Right? So the idea was to reduce each district's revenue per member by 5.5%, and then that districts would also see savings on the expense side because there are other reductions made to teacher benefit packages. So, yes, sir.
Kind of in response to what she was saying about Mafru, back about 20 years ago, I contacted Sheila Harstrup about that. She gave me a big paper about it. She said, yeah, back in '93, Prescott was way more frugal. He was spending less per student. Milwaukee was way higher, so he set us in that rate. And perpetually, we're getting less. My question is, why can't we have it over again? Why is this 30 years old and we're still doing the same thing? We were doing the right thing 30 years ago by trying to save money per student, and now we're getting penalized.
I know that superintendents all across the state do a lot of advocacy around this specific topic. There was, over this most recent biennial budget, really after, and we talk about this a little bit later on, but this most recent biennial budget, we say spendable dollars, so like base building revenue was given to schools. The idea was instead that pandemic dollars should take that over. So I know that superintendents are working to answer that exact question. I wish I had a better answer. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us who's running this legislature in Wisconsin?
You know, my civic background is a little rusty.
Well, it should. Okay, so let me brief.
We have to settle.
You got 58 to 59% of the people in the state of Wisconsin in the aggregate that vote for assemblers, vote for the assembly, and vote for the Senate. 58% of those votes are voted for Democrats. However, the Wisconsin Assembly right now is about 65% Republican, and the Wisconsin Senate right now is about 60% Republican. Now, how the hell does that happen? There's a little thing called gerrymandering. Maybe you read it in 7th grade. If you haven't, read it again. And that's the reason why you have Scott Walker come in there and gut every school district in this state. Back in my day, it was Tommy Thompson. Gutted. You used to get 70% of the funding for schools in this state from the state. Now it's down to what? You guys got to tell me. Well under half? Is it 45%? Rick, I don't even know anymore. I don't even want to think about it.
It's slightly, Prescott's pretty close to about a 50-50 split.
Okay, all right.
But
So-
it's not the 2/3 that was promised.
So the reason that you're here right now is because the Republican Party of Wisconsin has decided they're going to cut school funding across the state. They're doing it to the universities. They're doing it to the Wisconsin University system. They're doing it to UW River Falls. They're doing it to Oshkosh. They're doing it down in Menominee. It's across the state. Now, you may or may not be aware of the fact that on Monday, Governor Evers signed a new law into Wisconsin which completely got rid of the gerrymandering and made the maps equal now. And without getting into telling you who the hell to vote for, I'm telling you that what this community has voted for has kicked you right square in the gut. And I urge you all to read about this and try to figure out exactly what's going on. You're going to get a new state assemblyman. Dietrich's gone. He's not going to be in our assembly meeting. I don't even know I can stop.
Can we stop?
Yeah.
Because I'm tired of listening to your politics. We're not here to listen about this. We're here to listen.
That's what's causing it. Get out of town. Hell, I've been here for 52 years. I kind of.
I mean, we came here to listen to her.
So,
So the point I'm
yes,
trying to
yes,
say-
yes. So what is suggested is that if it's not coming via the local legislature, is that it falls in the hands of the community, and the community can decide whether or not they will vote to increase revenue limits, or the district's revenue limit authority. So Prescott is not alone. The map to the right, the blue map, represents districts who have passed an operational referendum question since revenue limits were established. So you'll notice that's the majority of the state. And then the bar chart represents the number of districts that have at least 10% of their revenue limit supported by a non-recurring operating referendum. So that means that voters are approving over 10% of the district's revenue limit authority, which makes up the majority of their operating budget. So 10% in a district of, that has a $10 million budget, that's notable, right? $1 million is challenging to reduce, and it's usually staff. So Prescott is not alone. This represents the districts who have asked the question, right? So those who have passed is this slide versus those who have asked. And I happen to know that after last night, the number of districts who, going into this April, that 357 districts who are asking is now 362, right? So it's not unique to Prescott. So when we work with districts, we try to kind of dive into the numbers and say, okay, so how did this happen? Why is this happening? What can we determine is kind of the driving cause, right? So we talked about declining enrollment. That absolutely plays a role. We talked about the biennial budget. That absolutely plays a role. And then most notably in the last 2 years, pandemic revenue, what we call ESSER revenue, ESSER funding, was COVID relief funds that were provided to schools initially to just stay open and continue educating kids. And then it became apparent that the biennial budget wasn't going to be providing additional spendable dollars, and so instead districts should be using ESSER revenue, pandemic revenue, to balance their budgets. Okay, so in Prescott, you can see that kind of helped to, I think, maybe mask or slow the district's need to have to go. That the size of those ESSER dollars looks different in all districts across the state, but I think that really what it did was it just slowed the need for districts to have to go sooner. So I know that this is a lot, visually very overwhelming. This is an output from our BAIRD budget forecast model. And this is without the referendum. So this is what we work with districts on to say, okay, what is driving these deficits? Are they structural? What are some items that we can analyze to possibly pull out? Is there anything else that we aren't thinking of? So in this case, we've got a couple years of historical data, a couple years of forecasted data, but the biggest, most important pieces, I think, really, are the district's Fund 10, which is their general fund, their operating fund revenue, the district's expenses, the fund balance, which is not cash in the bank, right? So the district can't just draw on the fund balance number that's listed on the next line below whenever they want to, right? It's as the result of a formula. Assets minus liabilities gives a district its equity. It's not always available in cash, which I think is sometimes a misconception. So it's not just, building money in the bank. And then the district's total school-based tax levy, which gets calculated into a mill rate, which is how school districts kind of compare their tax rates across the state. Okay? So this is without the referendum, right? You see a lot of red numbers, and notably, kind of headed into the future. There we go. This is kind of a light little little guy. Okay, so you can see into the future that fund balance figure gets smaller and smaller. And districts at a certain point, if they reach below a certain fund balance threshold, the board sets a policy on what they think is most appropriate. It's different in every school district across the state, but if a district falls below a certain amount, they may have to cash flow borrow, which incurs interest costs, which is, taxpayer money, right? So this is a scenario if Prescott did not go to referendum. And this is that bar chart that you saw 2 slides ago with the recurring referendum layered in. Okay, so that gold bar represents the recurring revenue limit authority. So you'll notice that it's approved, or it's added on in the year that it's approved, which would be 24-25. And then it gets added to the district's base revenue limit authority in the next year. Okay, so it's one time, it gets added to the district's base, and then it stays with the district. Versus non-recurring, it comes on in the years that it's authorized, and then it goes off. Oopsie. So I believe this is a visual that Sue prepared to help demonstrate how the district can maintain a healthy fund balance. The green line, I believe, represents a $1 million recurring, which is not what people are voting on. They're voting on the 1.2, which is the blue line, which is above, and essentially it kind of helps to demonstrate an arc that allows the district to stay in a safe financial position from a fund balance perspective. I was working with a school district who failed an operating question, and then they depleted their fund balance to such a level that they actually had a negative fund balance, which means that they had to borrow money to operate, and then they actually had to borrow money to pay back the money that they borrowed. That is not a good position to be in. Their community ultimately voted yes to rebuild their fund balance and to support their schools, but it was, it got pretty dire. They had to reduce 10% of their budget, and it was not a fun experience for anyone involved. So, not to suggest that would be what would happen, but that is an extreme scenario of a case where a district depleted its fund balance to a level where it was at zero. Yes, ma'am.
So in those districts that depleted their fund balance, during your experience doing this work, have you seen school districts that have had to consolidate? Where now kids are having 45-minute rides to school on the bus and so on?
And Elise, can you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question was, in school districts that deplete their fund balance to such a level, have they considered consolidation, or have they actually consolidated, and has that solved the problem? So I can share anecdotally of some districts that I know that did consolidate, and it went well. And I know of some districts and they did consolidate, and it's still a little bit tricky, and it hasn't necessarily been the cost savings or the tax savings that they expected. So that, I think there's a misconception that once you combine school districts, then school taxes go away, or that they are significantly decreased. However, depending on who you're combining with, they may have outstanding debt obligations, right? Like, so Prescott has Fund 39 debt, neighboring districts may not. They may have other liabilities on their balance sheet. So all this to say,
the transportation usually goes very high, and that's very expensive.
Right, especially in rural school districts where you're busing kids from all over, and the size of the district is very large, square miles wise. So yes, it has been explored in many districts. So this is the recurring scenario. So this is what will be on the ballot on April 2nd. This is the $1.2 million recurring question. You can see that right here on the recurring referendum row. Okay, so you'll notice that the district's surplus, the revenues increase, the district is able to forecast a surplus. And I know that Rick and Sue have some ideas about, how that would be handled. So there will be a tax impact. It's not a no impact solution. The district is looking to raise revenue limit authority in this box, and that goes to the total school levy, which is distributed amongst the local community. Okay, so we take that levy, divide it by the district's equalized property value, so the fair market value that falls within the district's boundaries. And then we multiply that times 1,000 in order to get a mill rate, so we can say, you know, what are we paying here in Prescott? What are people paying in River Falls, in Hudson, in Elmwood, in Plum City, etc. So all this to say that $1 million in Prescott looks different than $1 million in River Falls or in Plum City, right? So I think Plum City is like 1/12 the size of Prescott, and I believe River Falls is maybe triple or quadruple the size of Prescott. So $1 million impacts its citizens in different ways. Right, so if you, let's imagine for a moment that this number, this is $1 million, and then you divide it by the equalized property value in River Falls, and you divide it by the property value in Prescott, or you divide it with the property value in Plum City. That outcome is going to look different. So we don't always know what's going on in the other components of the school district's levy, but that's just to kind of help explain why tax impacts will look different in communities across the state. So, as I mentioned, this is not a no impact situation. The district is expected to see a tax increase of almost approximately 80 cents on the mill rate. That's $80 on a $100,000 home. So you can also see that over time the district's mill rate has gone down. Mill rate is what schools use. You're not going to see mill rate on your tax bill, right? So essentially what it says is that there's more equalized property value, and in these years of inflationary growth, right, that mill rate would be expected to go down, right? We're seeing homes going for so much more than they were ever before, right? And so how much of that equalized property value is inflationary growth versus true growth can kind of help you know what the true impact of that might be. But we know that the referendum is expected to increase the mill rate by about 80 cents. So what that means to taxpayers is that on a $100,000 home, we use that for easy math as well. Think about the value of your own property, and then you can kind of multiply it using that $100 as a benchmark. And then what that equates to on a monthly basis. So some things that the district has done in order to help save taxpayer dollars over time through the debt issuance process, districts are able to levy a certain dollar amount in that debt service, that referendum approved debt levy, which is this one right here. Okay, so these funds are used to prepay debt that went towards that capital referendum. So you can levy additional dollars in years where it's favorable in order to save interest costs. So in that case, the district has already taken the opportunity to refinance referendum approved debt, which saved almost $1 million. Additionally, the district is considering at tonight's board meeting as well, prepaying some debt that will offer an additional $500,000 of interest savings.
Please, could you explain again how money is in different buckets? Why don't we just use that money and put it towards operations? You
got it. So it sits in its own separate fund. It can only be used to pay the principal and interest on a loan for the purposes of building. So they have to stay separate. They cannot commingle. They have to stay in separate bank accounts. They get accounted for and audited differently. So they cannot go to fund one another. They have to stay separate. And then I believe Rick and Sue are going to speak to these slides. These are kind of the why, right? Like the why is the district seeking an operational referendum at this point? What would you be voting on?
So as you walked in the school, we hope, or if you come into our schools and read some of the literature, you know that our school districts, academically, Michael Kozmowski is in the audience, is also our teaching and learning director. Prescott Public Schools currently is in the top 10% in reading and math in the entire state. So when you look at the 421 districts in the state, Prescott Public Schools has amplified and elevated its performance, and a lot of that has to do with the investments that we've made in our programs, in our interventionists, in the way that we are able to meet students where they are, from whether or not they're at the low, middle, or high end. We are also taking students, whether or not they're at the low, middle, or high end, and moving them. So there's a growth figure about where students start and where they end at the end of the year, and they compare that to all students that are equally situated at the low, middle, and high end. Prescott Public Schools is in the top 15% of all schools within the state of Wisconsin. In addition, we compare, there's a handout there, it's copied front to back, and it's highlighted in yellow, green. Can I borrow that?
More copies.
Really easy, because it's like a heat map. And basically what we look at is looking at when schools are performing lower than Prescott, it's in yellow. And when they're higher than Prescott, it is in blue. And what you'll see is that a preponderance of all those squares are basically by middle border schools, by grade in reading and math, showing whether or not Prescott Public Schools are performing at a proficient level. Those are the things that you and why we're asking for an operating levy, because it's investing and making sure that we sustain the excellence that's been put forward. We also want to make sure that the 3 A's, right? We talk about the academics a lot, but we understand that students need to be well-rounded. And so we're looking at students to be able to be in the fine arts, right? And in extracurriculars, whether or not they're on stage, they're doing speech, they're gifted and talented, they're competing in different ways and being able to be creative. We also want to look at athletics and making sure that students are able to, and we've seen really great performances from our high school teams. The female dance team will be here today, 30-time state champions, right? Our girls golf team, 4-time state champions, right? Small but mighty. There was a joke there. She thought it's more, but I'll hold that. All right? But when we talk about what operations are, it doesn't matter whether or not we have 10 students in a classroom, 20 students in a classroom, or 30 students in a classroom. The costs don't change with regards to running our buses out in every direction to get them transported to school. We still have to pick them up and deliver them, whether or not the bus is full of 77 students or 30 students. We still run every single kitchen and staff so that we provide breakfast and lunch for our students, making sure that they're well fed so that they're attentive and benefiting from the academic delivery and the programs that we have. Over time, Prescott has invested in our staff, and our staff have taken classes at the master's level so that we can provide college-level classes at our high school, either through advanced placement or articulated credits, and also in career and tech ed. Many of our students are leaving with multiple college credits. Mr. Kozmowski, I'll put you on the spot. Roughly, how much dollars have families saved per year based on our graduating class?
probably the average over the last 5 years has been $150,000 a year.
So in a graduating class of 100, 110 students lately, families are saving over $100,000 in future college classes, which means our graduates are starting a little bit higher, saving families money, not taking out loans, not racking up debt. We also want to make sure that when we have the programs of feeding them, transporting them, we also are investing in programs like STEP. And so we are integrating and asking students to take math and engineering and technology and infusing that in a problem-solving, collaborative, and creative way. And that starts at kindergarten, goes all the way up into high school. We have a lot of, and if you have time, please take the time to walk through our building at the end. You can see some of the wonderful spaces that we have for laser cutters, plasma cutters, woodworking, architectural, computer programs. This requires funding to operate, and as BAIRD has shown, unfortunately, it has not been coming from the legislature. And so 6 of the previous 8 years, public schools received 0 increases per pupil. And you all know what has happened with your paychecks and your pocketbooks with regards to inflation. We still buy food, we still buy gas, we still run lights, we still have to heat and cool our buildings. Again, whether or not there's 10, 20, or 30 students in that room. So that cost creates a bigger gap. And unfortunately, at this time, that gap has to be filled by a community investing in its own community, its own students. And it doesn't matter if you have students as a parent, or a grandparent, or a community member. They're all our kids. Ultimately, they're the future leaders of Prescott and Prescott's community. So, what we believe is that strong communities invest in its schools, strong schools create good communities, it drives people here, it keeps people here, it helps property values. Property values that go up, yes, there is a tax impact. And we're trying to at least manage a lot of the things through fiscal management, and you'll see some of the steps that we had during our board meeting, so that when we do ask, it's the least amount, but it's the amount that will keep the lights on, our staff here, and our programs in place. Okay. Next slide. So, Elise shared a little bit, is that between paying off loans, like paying your mortgage early, previously we saved just under $1 million. Tonight we'll be talking about and hopefully enacting the defeasance on a bond. Prescott taxpayers will have saved over the last 4 years $1.5 million in future taxes paying off interest on high interest loans. In addition, we are tightening our belt. And so when you saw the graphs, you should have seen 2022, 2023 was the highest expenses that the Prescott Public Schools had. And it's decreased this year. Our expenses were cut. We're cutting another $650,000. That $650,000 is going to be coming from efficiencies, working with Tim Runquist and our bus routes to try to find better ways to transport our students and reduce the overall costs. In addition, we will be cutting back on our supplies and materials. Some of that comes from the savings that we have based on the 2022 bond referendum. You invested in your facilities. That saves on our mechanical breakdowns. It saves on, we become green, more energy efficient, and therefore we will be able to reduce some facility and grounds. Sorry, Mike. Right? But that's a good, wise investment of dollars. We also, obviously, will be right-sizing our classes and number of sections based on board-approved class sizes. In elementary, the range is about 20 to 24. Currently, we do have smaller class sizes than that. We run very, very small staff-to-teacher ratios. That's great, but we also have to tighten our belt, and we are going to match that 20 to 24 all the way up into 612 as well. That'll save some additional dollars. We are also looking at increasing revenue. And so we have looked at some of the work that Andrew Caudill, our activities director, has done. The community, the business community, you see a lot of investment going on with advertisement that is bringing in dollars to save Fund $10 that run our athletic programs. Then also our current tech ed, they have sought out grants and currently are kind of have an entrepreneurial grant. You'll see that they create sheds, they are selling merchandise and cutting boards over at the tax, and they are doing things with plasma and steel cutters. And that is generating over $35,000 to $40,000 funded back that is helping sustain that program and buy their supplies. So we buy the supplies and they're being able to generate and have real life skills about marketing, putting it together, selling, and then being able to bring that back. Next. So these are the tough, one more back. Okay. So the reality though, right, is it's ultimately a community's decision. And the decision is April 2nd. And it's about, are you willing to invest in your local community, invest in its students, invest in the property or programs, the outcomes that we talked about, and its people. Beyond the 650, that's already in place and starting to move. If it is unsuccessful, Prescott Public Schools and the finance and the school board will be faced with the challenge of removing another $1.2 million. We already know that we're underfunded by $4 million based on just inflation from 2009. That's another $1.2 million. We would not be a viable, vibrant school. We can run, but it definitely would impact the type of programs we just talked about, the performance that we've been able to generate, and being able to retain all the people. Things that we would do is anything that's not required and not essential would have to be put in front of the board for decisions. These are tough decisions. And those decisions would mean is that we are not required to run in-town busing for any child that is within 2-mile radius. That would have to be one of the first things that would be put forward. Food service programming, we do support St. Joe's and we provide personnel and a lot of the software. If we have to cut more than $1.2 million, there's no way that we can continue to be a good neighbor and be reducing the personnel within the public schools while we're providing programming and staffing over at St. Joe's. I've had that discussion with both the pastor and with Mr. McGee. They are unaware of this scenario and we hope that it doesn't come. Athletics, WIA, we talked about being well-rounded in the arts and athletics. We would keep the senior varsity teams, but we would likely have to remove opportunities for students at the C level and the coaches. We would have to curtail middle school and high school theatrical performances, although they do bring in house dollars. It still runs about another $30,000 for those productions in combination. It is not something that we believe is in the best interest of students, but these are the things that oftentimes have to be reduced when you're faced with a 1.2 reduction. Obviously, pay freezes and benefit reviews would have to go under review, and we'd have to look at how that would play out. We have one more year with our health partners, and we would have to put that out to bid and see if competitive bidding would change that outcome. Last slide. So, other things obviously is that middle school currently is a middle school model. It's exploratory. Students get many different options and opportunities. A junior high model would change it where they would have to go to an 8-period day, and it would remove a lot of what we believe are fascinating and creative collaboration that occurs for students during that time as they mature going into high school. That would reduce about 8 positions It's undesirable for both students and staff, but it would have to be something that we would consider. Class sizes here, beyond the 650 we talked about, we were just trying to stay within the limits. If we have to cut another 1.2 million, we would have to seriously consider that those limits and targets are no longer viable, and class sizes would go and be elevated above the 2024. We probably have to seriously consider something that the board will be hearing more about, but a 4-day week. And so some other districts have gone to this, and where you have a 4-day week to be able to shutter some of the buildings, save on electricity, save on the utilities, and staffing costs. Obviously, we would also be looking at anything that is beyond the classroom. And so we are an organization, our mission is about learning, and so we run many different types of businesses. We run a transportation department, we run a food service, we run custodian. We would have to start to look at if outside vendors and outsourcing can be more economical. And the board likely would have to ask the finance department and myself to investigate whether or not there are cost savings in those areas. That is not what we believe is in the best interest of our community, not in the best interest of being able to support people that live in our community and work here in the district, but are things that we have to consider. And obviously, non-essential travel and professional development outside of the district that goes against the nature of a learning organization would have to be cut. So, this is the question that's going to appear on the ballot. What we're talking about is our future, and whether or not the values of a community are worth investing in its schools, in its students, and we believe that the balance, albeit tough, because we are asking people to raise their taxes. Ultimately, each community member has to identify whether or not the value of $320 on a $400,000 house is worth the performance of being a top 10 in academics, top 15% in growth, being able to participate in athletics and theater across every single grade, and participate in programming 12 months a year through our summer school and extensions. So, with that, are there any questions that anybody has with regards to the question and the status that we're at?
So obviously if all of those things are cut, that's not what's best for our students. If it doesn't pass, have we looked at cutting down one of the buildings to save a lot of money? So we don't have to cut programs, staff and all that and consolidate into 3 buildings instead?
Yeah, those will be things that'll have to, one of the biggest challenges the board has.
Can you repeat the
Yes,
question?
yep. So one of the questions from the audience was, would the school district or the board consider having to close one of its buildings and consolidate to save for savings? And it is something that would have to be considered. The concern I would have as an administrator is being able to reshuffle that and reconfigure our schools based on the space in the number of months that we have. The amount of planning that took place to move and create 1220 St. Croix Street into a middle school took years of talk, discussion, and months of planning. I don't think that that would be in the best interest. One of the things that we have is that we are working on a Vision 2035, where the community and the board are looking at longer term about what will look like over the next decade and a half. And we think that's where that conversation is best had, is obviously when you have time, what is the grand master plan for Prescott Public Schools? Right now, we're trying to take care of the imminent, urgent need so that we can make timely and strategic decisions. Question in the back?
Yes, mine's got a 2-part question. If this does get passed, and there's no sign of inflation decreasing anytime soon, that seems to be kind of the cost of everything going on. What's the plan for the school board to do then? So if this is it's gonna happen every 4 years or 3 years, and we're back in this room talking about another referendum, and taxes increasing, that's hurting everybody's bottom dollar. And that would kind of be double taxed, the things that are already being taxed on. On the other end of that, though, is that for some reason, state legislature does pass to get more funding, which I believe is that they will, and back in $100 million surplus again this year. What's the school board's plan for relieving, I guess, the taxpayers of that money?
Really good questions. I'll start with the first, right? And so, what confidence do you have? So the question was, is what steps can the community, what steps or confidence can the community have that the school board is being fiscally wise so that as inflation continues, we're not going to have to go out for another operating levy? And I would say that we are currently operating under an operating levy that happened in 2016. It's been 8 years, and that is something that I don't think you can promise will never occur. But I would say that the steps that the board has taken, such as paying off loans early, moving to more energy efficiency to at least mitigate or lower the cost of lighting. We have newer mechanical, more efficient boilers. We're saving on heating, we're saving on water to the degree that those rates don't change. They're at least better. So I think that and our last 3 budgets, you've seen a reduction in expenses. So the board has taken corrective action and steps to lower that. The flip side is there is a surplus currently in Madison, over $3 billion. However, when they had $7 billion, they didn't give us a lot, and they gave us kind of 50 cents on the dollar. All I would say is that to some degree, with the maps being maybe redistributed, I think our community, and I'll share with you in the board meeting what superintendents have been doing, but it's time for us to at least challenge our representatives to say that the money that's taxed, that's hanging out in Madison, should be reinvested in its communities. I mean, they collect it for a reason, and it shouldn't be in a bank account. And so that's one of the challenges that I think will have to happen. If the legislature were somehow to fund, and all of a sudden there were major surpluses, the school board has the right to levy less than the limit that's approved, so they can always levy less, or they could use that money to pay off debt so that you ultimately save in the future. In the back?
Perchance if it wouldn't pass, a question for Elise, because she's seen a number of school districts go through this. Have you seen a number of students then, with all these types of cuts that look like they'd be forthcoming, open enroll to other school districts that are nearby, thus reducing the number of students that we have, and therefore property taxes go down? People don't want to move into the community. Have you seen that type of thing happen?
Yeah, so the question was, in communities where school referendums don't pass, do we see students leaving those schools, leaving those communities to go to other schools? I can say oftentimes first, the district will come back for another referendum. They will do anything that they can in order to keep those kids, keep those, strong schools, strong communities, right? There is one pretty dramatic example back about 5 or 7 years ago where they failed an operating referendum. The entire school board resigned. It was replaced by entirely new people. Their open enrollment net, skyrocketed. All the surrounding districts were saying, well, what are we going to do to prepare to, if they do divide up the school district, if it dissolves, then, we don't want and we want. And so it was really messy. It was bad. That is an extreme example. I think first, the district would take the steps kind of outlined by Rick, and then second, probably reapproach the question, reframe it, and go from there instead.
I'm just concerned with talking about all those types of programmings. not being available,
Yep.
huge class sizes, that there are other school districts around us that have passed referendums and parents saying, oh, well, I want my child now to go over there because they have those types of programs that we currently have.
Yep, absolutely. And that kind of, I think, speaks to, the school districts that, they were saying kind of depending on what the community supports, those schools then kind of end up winning or losing.
And you kind of create what oftentimes we look at as a death spiral, right? It's self-fulfilling prophecy. And so ultimately that could be the concern. Ultimately, April 2nd, the question that's about the values for its community. We have time for one more question, so we'll get to you. And then we do have a formal board meeting that starts, and so we want to make sure that also, the business of the board can happen. So, question.
Okay, so I moved up here from southern Wisconsin, a small little district, very similar to this one. Wonderful results, wonderful, a lot like this district. But very close to some sizable private schools, okay? And so we fought the open enrollment thing and won. But with the state legislature, the 2/3 funding, that was a pipe dream, that was years ago. And then state legislature has been just absolutely committed to funding voucher schools, funding private schools. I went to private school for 8 years, my parents paid for it, fine. But now we taxpayers are paying for those students to go to private schools. Private schools who could absolutely discriminate against my daughter, who had autism, didn't have to take my daughter, okay? So the schools that educated me would never keep my daughter for a week, okay? She's a research scientist now because of public schools. And so now that I live here, I have to come. I know that you're investing in these kids. I don't have any kids in the district, but I just want to know, you don't have a lot of private schools around. Have you lost revenue to private schools through vouchers?
You can share that all school districts, right?
Yes.
Have to participate in local taxes are going to the bigger markets that have families that are taking advantage of vouchers and/or private schools.
Yep, so I will give the really boring answer, which is, the short answer is that yes, $19,786 on the district's current revenue limit worksheet. It is a tax on the local resident. It gets transited out as a expense, right? So it's budget neutral. It comes on as revenue, goes out as an expense, but it does impact how the school is aided, right? So that property tax relief. And then larger schools who have more vouchers are pulling aid out of the formula because they have a larger shared cost, right? So I can also share that there is a bill in Madison right now that is seeking to decouple vouchers, so pulling vouchers out of the public school formula, and what that might mean is property tax relief. It just passed the assembly, it goes to the Senate, and then it goes to the governor, so that's what our team is analyzing right now, but did that answer your question?
Well, you're fortunate. I mean, you don't have a lot of private schools around you, where I lived before we did, and it hit us very hard, very. So, thank you for answering that.
Well, on behalf of the school board and as the administrative team, I want to thank you for coming out. For those that were listening tonight, obviously, we appreciate that you took time. A reminder that this recording will be posted on the district website. So if you want to replay any of it or share it with a friend or colleague, please feel free to do so. So at this time, we're going to conclude the town hall meeting. Asking the board president, 5-minute transition, starts at 10. 10? All right. So the school board meeting, if you are here for that, will officially begin at 7.